Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister at the time, was in his office having a very secret meeting with top intelligence officer Brigadier Colin Gubbins. During their meeting, Churchill instructed Gubbins to set up a special team for a risky mission called Operation Postmaster. The goal was to stop Nazi submarines from getting fuel on the island of Fernando Po, which was controlled by Spain. The next day, Gubbins followed Churchill's orders and met with Gus March Phillips, a soldier who had just been released from military jail. Gubbins chose Gus to lead the special team because he was known for being a tough soldier who didn't always follow orders, which Gubbins thought was perfect for this secret job. Gubbins explained to Gus that their mission, Operation Postmaster, was to seize a Nazi fuel ship heading to Fernando Po Island in West Africa. The island was protected by German, Spanish, and Italian troops, so no one else, including other British military forces, could know about their plan. Although Gubbins hadn't formally asked Gus yet, Gus was ready to take on the mission because he really disliked the Nazis. Gus agreed but insisted on choosing his own team without Gubbins interfering. Gubbins was okay with this as long as Gus completed the mission successfully. Right away, Gus invited a sailor named Henry Hayes, an expert in sailing, Freddie Alvarez, a skilled explosives expert and swimmer, and Anders Lassen, a strong fighter who could use all sorts of weapons from guns to bows and arrows. Gus also wanted to add Geoffrey Appleyard, a former colleague and a smart war strategist, to his team. However, Geoffrey was caught as a British spy and was now in a Nazi prison, so Gus and his team planned to rescue him first before starting their mission. On their way to the island where Geoffrey was held, Gus's ship got stopped by Nazi troops patrolling the waters. The Nazi commander sent some soldiers to question Gus and his crew. At that time, Gus tried to pretend they were fishermen from Sweden, but the Nazis didn't believe him. Even after searching the ship and finding nothing suspicious, the Nazi soldiers wanted to burn Gus's ship because it had entered German waters without permission. Gus had expected this might happen. Just as the Nazi soldiers were about to set his ship on fire, Gus and his men fought back and defeated all the Nazi soldiers. Meanwhile, the Nazi commander ordered his men to shoot at Gus's ship with cannons. At the same time, Freddie swam back to tell Gus he had placed a bomb under the Nazi ship. Soon after, the Nazi ship blew up before they could fire at Gus's ship. Meanwhile, Colin had also sent two spies, Richard Heron and Marjorie Stewart, to gather important information to help Gus complete his mission. Now Richard and Marjorie were on a train with German soldiers who had documents about U-boats. At that time, Marjorie, who was also an actress, was able to trick the soldiers and grab the suitcase with the U-boat papers. With Richard's help, Marjorie got the suitcase to her train compartment, where they used a telegraph to send the information about the U-boats to the intelligence agency in London. This information helped Colin figure out how to sink the Nazi submarine. At the same time, Gus and his team were planning to rescue Geoffrey, who was locked up at a Nazi military base in West Africa. They sailed to the location and climbed up a cliff to avoid being seen by Nazi guards. Before they could rescue Geoffrey, Gus and his team did some spying, but two Nazi soldiers spotted them. Luckily, Anders managed to knock out the two soldiers with his bow, distracting other soldiers and drawing them toward Gus's position. Soon after, Anders used his crossbow to knock out the guards outside while the rest of the team sneaked into the soldiers' restrooms and took them out to draw other soldiers out. Anders set off a grenade in one of the rooms. This was perfect timing because Freddie had just taken control of a Nazi long-range shooting machine, and he was able to quickly take down all the soldiers who came to check out the explosion. Meanwhile, Gus and Henry handled the remaining soldiers at the base and Anders went to find Geoffrey. Working together, they were able to rescue Geoffrey, who had been tortured by the Nazi soldiers. To cover their tracks, Gus decided to blow up the Nazi base before more troops could arrive. Once they got back to their ship, Gus filled Geoffrey in on their mission and asked for his help in planning their trip to Fernando Po Island. At that time, Geoffrey was glad to be part of such an important mission and explained that they needed to avoid sea areas controlled by the German and British militaries. Unfortunately, this meant they had to take a longer route that would take them 15 days to reach Fernando Po, compared to the shorter route through controlled waters. Since their mission needed to stay secret, they had no choice but to take the longer, safer path to avoid detection. Back to Richard and Marjorie, they had made it to Fernando Po Island to gather info about ships bringing fuel for Nazi submarines. Their plan was for Marjorie to get close to the Nazi commander in charge of the island. Meanwhile, Richard, who already knew the commander, Glur, felt comfortable enough to invite him to a party at a local bar. Richard introduced Marjorie as a businesswoman who would also be at the party. Heinrich, not knowing who Marjorie really was quite taken by her looks. After their meeting, Marjorie and Richard went back to their hotel while continuing their investigation. During their investigation, they stumbled upon the body of a woman in a warehouse who had been tortured by Heinrich. This discovery made Marjorie worry about her own safety, and she became hesitant about getting closer to Heinrich. As a seasoned spy, Richard reassured her and promised to keep her safe if Heinrich showed any signs of danger towards her. The next day, Richard and Marjorie went to a bar where a Spanish military commander was angry because a Nazi fuel tanker was blocking a Spanish ship. The Spanish commander was frustrated with the German military's greedy behavior, even though Fernando Po was controlled by 3 countries. Richard tried to calm the Spanish commander, while Marjorie started her plan by getting close to Heinrich. They had lunch together, and Heinrich asked Marjorie to be his date for the party. Shortly after, Richard joined them and told Heinrich about the angry Spanish commander. Heinrich was annoyed but couldn't do much because the Spanish military was an ally and the U-boat fuel carrier was leaving 3 days earlier than planned. This meant the Spanish commander wouldn't have time to complain much. With this crucial information, Richard and Marjorie quickly returned to their hotel to inform Colin about the new departure schedule for the U-boat fuel carrier using the telegraph. Once Colin got the update, he immediately passed it on to Gus and the rest of the team. Since the ship carrying Nazi submarine fuel was leaving earlier than planned, Gus and his team had to get to Fernando Po as quickly as possible. This meant they had to take the fastest and most dangerous route, passing through areas guarded by both the German and British military. Meanwhile, the German Air Force had bombed London. When Prime Minister Winston Churchill heard about this, he sent a message to Gus and his team urging them to quickly sink the Nazi fuel ship. By doing this, Britain could fight back against the German attacks at sea. This message made Gus and his team even more determined to complete their mission, especially since they only had 2 more days of sailing to reach Fernando Po. Unfortunately, during their voyage, a British military ship stopped them and demanded they surrender. The British military thought Gus was on a mission without their approval, and even though Gus explained it was ordered by the Prime Minister, they didn't believe him and insisted they surrender. In the middle of this argument, a Nazi U-boat submarine appeared in the area, causing the British military to prepare for an attack. At that time, Gus and his team used this distraction to make their escape. Switching to Fernando Po Island, Richard and Marjorie continued their mission by meeting a war veteran and weapons dealer named Campbell Koo, who was a good friend of Richard's. Richard wanted to convince Campbell to help them fight the German military, especially since Campbell hated the Nazis. At first, Campbell wasn't sure he could take on the powerful German forces. Hearing this, Marjorie pointed out that the British military was also very skilled and even she, who wasn't a soldier, was good with weapons. Marjorie then demonstrated her shooting skills, which impressed Campbell. Finally, he agreed to help them. After this success, Richard and Marjorie contacted Gus to let him know that Campbell would be helping them. The next day, Gus and his team arrived near Fernando Po Island, where they secretly met Richard and Campbell, who had come by boat. Jeffrey explained their plan and asked Richard to cut off the electricity in the Nazi barracks so the power would go out at the German military headquarters. Richard also planned to invite all the Nazi soldiers to a party to distract them, making it easier for Gus and his team to complete their mission. After understanding the plan, they began preparing all the weapons provided by Campbell. Next, Richard went to the Nazi military's electrical control room to place a bomb. Unfortunately, some Nazi soldiers walked in and caught him, so Richard had to fight them off. At night, Gus and his team were ready to move and waited for the lights in the German military barracks to go out before starting their mission. Meanwhile, Marjorie and Heinrich arrived together at a costume party for high-ranking Nazis at a bar. At the same time, another party was happening for the lower-ranking troops in the military hall. During the party, Heinrich spoke with the man responsible for repairing the U-boat submarine. The man told Heinrich that the submarine's hull had been covered with new steel plates, making it very difficult to blow up or sink. Marjorie overheard this conversation and quickly reported it to Richard, who was also at the party. She told Richard they should cancel the mission because the explosives wouldn't be able to sink the submarine. However, Richard insisted that they could not cancel the mission. Meanwhile, British Navy officials visited Colin and asked the intelligence agency to cancel the mission and order Gus to return to England immediately. Colin didn't seem to care because of order from the Prime Minister. After the Navy officials left, Colin reported to Winston about their plans being discovered by the British military. Winston still asked Colin to continue the mission and said he would take responsibility if Gus failed. Meanwhile, Gus was frustrated because they had to change their plans after learning they couldn't blow up the U-boat submarine. Jeffrey suggested they steal the ship carrying fuel for the U-boat instead. He believed that if they stuck to the original plan, they would likely fail. With no other options, Gus and the others agreed with Jeffrey's idea and quickly set it into action. Soon after, Anders used his crossbow to take out the Nazi soldiers in the watchtower, allowing his team to climb onto the ground and start shooting at the guards. Freddy planted explosives in several spots, while Jeffrey and Campbell's men sneaked onto the Nazi ships in the harbor to eliminate the enemy soldiers. They locked the doors to the military hall where the soldiers were partying. With Campbell's help, Gus and the others managed to defeat the enemy troops. During the chaos outside the bar, the top Nazis were still enjoying their costume party inside because they didn't hear the commotion. Marjorie even sang to entertain the guests, making Heinrich even more fascinated with her. Unfortunately, Marjorie accidentally said something that revealed she wasn't German as she had claimed. Realizing he had been tricked, Heinrich planned to kill Marjorie by taking her to a room. Meanwhile, Gus was completing the mission and sent a signal to his team to gather, because the bomb on the Nazi submarine was about to explode. He also asked Richard to pick up Marjorie from the party. Suddenly, they heard an explosion from the electrical control room, even though the bomb shouldn't have gone off yet. This alerted the enemy to the attack, causing Heinrich to delay his plan to interrogate Marjorie, and instead ordered his men to counterattack. Gus, not wanting to waste time, led his team to take the U-boat fuel carrier, even though they were under fire from the enemy. Fortunately, he managed to get the ship away from the Nazi military port. Shortly after, the Nazi troops discovered this and immediately gave chase while Freddy tried to help Henry, who was injured by enemy fire. Heinrich asked his allies what was going on, but they blamed the Nazis for failing to protect the island. Angry, Heinrich took his gun and shot 2 of his allies. He got even more upset when he saw a Nazi speedboat blown up by Gus and his team. Heinrich's men arrived with Marjorie, accusing her of being a spy. Just as Heinrich was about to punish her, Marjorie secretly pulled out her gun and shot him dead. Meanwhile, Gus was waiting for Richard and Marjorie, who luckily managed to catch up with him and the others after escaping the remaining Nazi troops using a speedboat. Finally, Winston's mission was completed, and they had to hand over the U-boat fuel carrier to the British Navy. Unfortunately, even though they had helped their country, Gus and his team were still considered war criminals by the British military, who didn't believe Gus was acting on Winston's orders. Campbell and his men were not detained since they weren't seen as part of Gus's team. Before parting ways, Gus thanked Campbell for his help. Gus and his team were then taken to London to be imprisoned. 4 weeks later, Winston breaks Gus and his team out of prison. During their meeting, Winston thanks Gus and the team for their hard work. Because they stole the U-boat fuel carrier, the Nazis couldn't use their submarine, which helped England win battles in the waters of West Africa. At the end of the film, Winston makes Gus's team an official unit under his government. Over time, Gus, known for being very clever and strong, becomes the inspiration for the legendary character James Bond. The film ends with the moral lesson. If you ever find yourself stealing a Nazi fuel ship, remember it might save the day, get you thrown in prison, and eventually